But I'm going to start with Martin van Nieuwkoop, who is from the World Bank. Martin was appointed the Global Director for Agriculture and Food Global Practice in the World Bank's Sustainable Development Practice Group in 2019. He provides leadership to the formulation and implementation of the bank's strategy and knowledge in agriculture and food, oversees the operationalization of the bank's vision on agriculture and food in regional and county programs, acts as senior spokesperson for the Agriculture and Food Bank wide and globally, and manages the Agriculture and Food Global Practice. Before taking his current position, Martin served for 2 years as the practice director of the World Bank's Agricultural Global Practice, where he oversaw the bank's agriculture lending portfolio and analytical work in the East Asia Pacific, Latin America, and Caribbean and South Asia regions, coordinated collaborations with IFC on agribusiness, and led the bank's global engagement on agriculture and climate change. So let's bring Martin up and start with the first presentation.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Paul, for this very nice introduction, and also thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. I mean, as Paul said, I'm working at the World Bank. The World Bank is one of the multilateral development banks in the world. I mean, our mission is a world free of poverty. We provide, grants and concessional credits, to countries across the world. I think we're active in about 170 countries. The bank's lending and grants every year a wide range of sectors: infrastructure, energy, transport, agriculture, health, education, social protection, social development, environment. You can just very multi-sectoral. Our financing every year is about $70 billion. The bank's portfolio in total, I think, is about $250 billion. So that's what the bank is about. Very pleased to talk about today about, okay, I think I need to go back a little bit. Sorry about this. I need to go to the beginning of my presentation, and it seems not to be working very well. There it is. Good. So my presentation comes in two parts. First is some context setting to provide, the rationale for repurposing agriculture policies and support for climate change and food security. And then I will do a little bit of a deep dive in a report that we published together with the International Food Policy Research Institute a few months ago, that actually indicates, the benefits that could be generated by repurposing agriculture policy and support, both for environmental objectives as well as for nutritional objectives. Okay, actually it's working. Very good. So let me start by saying that the global food system is not fit for purpose. In our view, the food system, could contribute to a healthy economy by being a driver of inclusive growth. Also, food systems, could contribute to healthy people by providing healthy diets. And of course, those are directly linked, to the quality of human capital. They could also provide, food systems could also actually provide and support healthy planets by providing nature-based solutions. Now, this is the vision, but the reality actually is very far from that vision. If you add up all the hidden costs of the food system, environment, and social, as well as the health costs, they end up about $12 trillion per year. So think about the number of people who are undernourished, malnourished, overweight, obese, the greenhouse gas emissions, the biodiversity loss, the food loss and waste. All those hidden costs add up to about $12 trillion per year. This is a big number. To put it in perspective, the market value of the global food system is about $10 trillion per year, which is about 12% of global GDP, which is about $87 trillion per year. So those hidden costs are massive. Now, while having a global food system that's not fit for purpose, at the same time, the sobering reality is also that the world food system, has huge medium and longer term challenges that are really daunting. Basically, the food systems need to produce food for 2 billion more people by 2050. With business as usual, that would require about 600 million more hectares of land under cultivation. And this is twice the size of India. It will result in massive deforestation. And the third challenge, of course, is also in line with the Paris Agreement for a 1.5 or 2 degree world. I mean, the greenhouse gas emissions from the global food systems need to be reduced to about 4 gigatons by 2050. I mean, that's the carbon budget that the global food systems has. So it needs to go down where it was in 2010. I mean, from 12 gigatons to 4 gigatons. With business as usual, actually, it will go up, I mean, to 15 gigatons. So you really have to kind of reverse the trend here. And that needs to happen at the same time when the headwinds of climate change are actually blowing harder and harder. So that's the challenge. Now, how much would it actually cost? I mean, to have a global food system that actually supports healthy people, healthy planets, and healthy people and a healthy economy. Some estimates have been done, and we've also actually contributed as World Bank to those estimates, and they boil down to about 300 to 400 billion dollars per year between now and 2030. The lesson there also is that not acting would actually cost a lot more. Since the cost of climate change are increasing the later the action is taken. But the good news is that a successful transformation, I mean, could also generate, I mean, very significant positive returns. I mean, the calculations of which we were part of is that the total economic gain, I mean, to society could reach $5.7 trillion a year by 2030 if this transformation is made successfully, and $10.5 trillion per year by 2050. And it will also create, I mean, significant business realities, business opportunities. So clearly, also from an economic point of view, I mean, this is the right thing to do. Now, what is our vision, and how is the bank going to support this transformation agenda? I'm the director of the Agriculture and Food Global Practice. The bank lends about $5 billion to $6 billion per year on agriculture and food. I mean, the portfolio of agriculture and food of the World Bank is about $24 billion. As I said, you need about $300 to $400 billion per year to make this transformation. So even if my portfolio is doubled, it's not going to happen. So we need to kind of leverage. We need to leverage what we are doing, and we see opportunities related to the $640 billion in public funds that actually annually governments provide in support of agriculture. This despite the fact actually that the food system as a whole is actually distracting value rather than adding value. See how we can bring in the $1 trillion in private investments and actually raise, I mean, the quality of those investments, and what can we do, I mean, to shift consumer food spending in the right direction. It's working on the demand side. So that's basically our approach. And this also kind of completes my first part of this presentation, the kind of the context setting of why repurposing the public support to agriculture is important. Now, so why did we do this report on repurposing agriculture policies and support? We clearly need to rethink and repurpose agriculture and food policies. I mean, persistent challenges to global food security and the essential threat of climate change, I mean, raise questions about the suitability of current agriculture policies and the incentives that they create to address the challenges of today's and tomorrow's food system. And this question, of course, also is being discussed, at the UN Food System Summit. I mean, that took place last year. I mean, the Conference of the Parties. I mean, the climate change negotiations in Glasgow last year, and all the fora. And studies actually show, I mean, that the present support that is provided to agriculture is not effective in solving the problems of global food security and stave off, the threat of climate change. So the question then that this study addresses is then how this massive public support, which is currently provided, to agriculture, $640 billion per year, could be repurposed, to deliver better outcomes for the health of people, the economies, and the planet. Now, let me just also say that over the past 60 years, of course, agriculture has performed impressively with food production, as shown on this slide, outpacing population growth, but continuing to feed the world's population, which, what I said, is expected to grow to 10 billion by 2050, and to do so sustainably is becoming increasingly difficult. And what we see is, despite the greater food production, global hunger actually has been on the rise since 2015. 2015 was also the year that the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN were adopted. Sustainable Development Goal number 2, zero hunger. That same year, the declining trend in hunger actually was reversed, and we actually see a growing trend, an increasing trend in food insecurity, accelerated by COVID-19, and now further pushed in the wrong direction because of the war in Ukraine. And also, as the panel on the right-hand side of this slide shows, the growth in food output per capita has both slowed and become more volatile in recent years. And of course, third, climate change is no longer a distant threat. Actually, it's already affecting agriculture, and I think if you talk to farmers, they would confirm that. Climate change has already slowed down productivity growth by 21% globally, and by as much as 40% in parts of Africa and other tropical zones. And you can see on the map, on how climate change actually is affecting different regions differently. Now, even more worrisome is that those adverse impacts of climate change are intensifying. Pushing the world towards a tipping point when climate change impacts offset all productivity growth with devastating consequences, of course. Now, before turning to the policy options, to address these challenges, I think this slide shows, the current kind of composition of public support around the world. So in 2016 to 2018, total support worldwide amounted to $638 billion per year. The level of support varies by country, but in absolute term, most of this support is provided and goes to farmers in China, the European Union, United States. And more than 70% is linked to farm production and input use, influencing market prices and production decisions. Which is very, very ineffective. This report shows actually that for every dollar of public support provided to agriculture, farmers only benefit 35 cents for every dollar spent. Only 70% of the current public spending on agriculture supports public goods such as research, development, rural infrastructure, and about 1/10, takes the form of subsidies, to consumers. So with that in mind, this report, looked at options on how, those current policies and support could be most effectively repurposed to solve, the problems of food insecurity, poverty, climate change, unsustainable patterns of food production and consumption. The research methodology, I think I skipped that slide. I think that's too much details. So the business as usual scenario that was developed, projects that emissions from agriculture production and land use change would double by 2040, with an additional 56 million hectares of land that would be converted to farmland between 2020 and 2040. And 80% of the growth in emissions under business as usual would come from producing livestock and rice. And despite in this base case scenario, we only project a very modest decrease in the global poverty in this baseline. So not a very attractive proposition moving forward. Then we looked at various options for repurposing. I mean, first one, we looked at what would happen if governments would eliminate all support to agriculture. A second scenario was what we considered, I mean, what difference a reallocation of support by commodity would do. And then there were two sub-scenarios. What if all agriculture commodities receive the same rate of support? Or what if support were reallocated to favor commodities with low greenhouse gas emissions? And then the third, we considered what would happen if payments to farmers were made conditional on reducing emission-intensive inputs with currently available technologies. And finally, we considered a scenario where the current support would be tied to develop and promoting productivity enhancing and emission reduction green innovations to targeted investments in R&D. So those are the scenarios that were looked at in this study. Now, what did we find? Clearly, I mean, the scenarios with removal or reallocation of support do not produce, I mean, the game-changing reductions in emissions needed for sustainability. The scenario, which is interesting, that makes payments to farmers conditional on adopting environmental practices with existing technologies would be beneficial, I mean, for generating greenhouse gas emission reductions, but not for nature. That's a kind of a complicated conclusion, but the issue is that the emission reductions would come at the cost of lower productivity, and this means actually that more land would be needed, I mean, to feed, I mean, the demand for food for 10 billion people. And repurposing support for green innovation, and that was the most attractive scenario, I mean, would lead to a 40% cut in emissions, and greater resource efficiencies would allow about 50 million hectares of agricultural land to be put back into natural habitats. And so that's basically an important conclusion of this report. Then the economic and social impacts of the different repurposing scenarios critically depend on what happened to productivity. When removing all support or reallocating it without improving productivity, the first bars on the graph that you can see here, we find very small gains or even losses for the overall economy, while farm output actually is falling. Poverty and food insecurity would rise, and healthy diets would become less affordable because of rising food prices. So in contrast, the repurposing a portion of the existing support for green innovations, I mean, those are the lower green bars on this slide, I mean, could generate triple or even quadruple wins by generating significant income growth, reducing poverty and food insecurity, and making healthy diets more affordable, in addition to benefiting environmental sustainability. So clearly, there are very attractive options there. Now, the key messages, in short, I mean, the key insights from the studies are that, first, current agriculture support is a very blunt instrument for fighting climate change and for addressing the challenges of global food security and nutrition. And second, I mean, there is great potential for achieving major gains on these fronts by repurposing support toward public investments that facilitate the widespread adoption of productivity enhancing and emission reducing technologies for agri-food systems. And then, of course, I mean, those policies are also likely to generate very strong positive environmental spillovers. So innovations that reduce environmental impacts and raise productivity are likely to either be rapidly adopted in other countries or to provide a basis for developing technologies for other agroecological environments. Now, the case for action is clear. We think that those findings make a very strong case for action and also, more to the point, I mean, for internationally coordinated action. We note also in the report that we are well aware why this is not happening yet, or actually is happening very, very slowly. So even the best designed policy reform will face political hurdles. I mean, there clearly is a big political economy dimension here. Of course, $640 billion in public support to a food system that subtracts value and have hidden cost of 12 trillion. there's no sound economic rationale for that. The fact that it exists is political. So overcoming the national resistance to agriculture policy reform from affected stakeholders will be a huge challenge. So better understanding of who are the likely winners and who are the likely losers are still be essential for earning political support. So that's also a very important part of, besides the economic case, in seeing what the social impacts are of those changes. Lastly, as I mentioned, action will have to be internationally concerted. I mean, this is because the challenges that we face are global. I mean, international coordination is also needed because the present agriculture support is distributed very unevenly across nations. I mean, poorer nations have less fiscal space to provide agriculture support. Also, their national agriculture research systems are weaker for developing high productivity and sustainable farm technologies and practices relevant, I mean, to the local context. So their farmers and all the food producers face bigger obstacles in agriculture in adapting those practices. So therefore, we need to be effective at the global level, and even and the diffusion of both technologies and financial resources will be needed so that all people, all economies, and on the entire planet, I mean, can actually benefit from those agriculture policy reforms. I think that it is from my side. Yes, thank you very much. And I like, you know, I mean, I'm looking forward very much to any questions you might have, and also kind of maybe any suggestions from the floor, how those, what you think, to what extent those research findings, I mean, could be translated into concrete and concerted action. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Martin. And with that, we'll move on to our second presentation, which is going to be from Felicia Wu. Dr. Wu is the John Hanna Distinguished Professor of Food Safety, Toxicology, and Risk Assessment at Michigan State University. She's an expert advisor to the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives, or JECFA, at the WHO and the FAO, and the FAO Scientific Advisory Committee on Livestock, Nutrition, and Health. Just recently, she's been elected as a fellow of the Society for Risk Analysis and has just been elected to the board of directors of the Harvard Agri-Food. So with that, I'll turn it over to Felicia.
I'm a bit shorter, so I need to adjust this down. Thank you very much, Dr. Hanlon, and it's a pleasure to have the chance to speak with you, to see many of you again after a long pandemic that's actually still ongoing. So Dr. van Nieuwkoop brought up a lot of very pertinent issues related to global food security. And I will continue in that vein to describe one aspect of food security, which is food safety, that is very much in some ways under threat because of climate change. I'm going to give a deep dive into one specific example and tell you a story about the problem of aflatoxin in US corn. Just this morning, I had the pleasure of learning that Dr. Wendelin Jones is actually an expert in aflatoxin as well. And so it was nice to talk about some of the toxicology. Much of this talk is going to be focused on climate change impacts. So first, this is my list of disclosures and conflicts of interest, my current grants, and my current advisory boards. First, I'd like to give you some background on aflatoxin, its health and economic impacts. I think that many of you have heard of aflatoxin, but I'll go into a bit more detail. Then I'll describe to you our econometric model that links aflatoxin with climatic factors such as maximum and minimum daily temperatures, precipitation and drought, and grower practices. Then I'll share with you the results that we found of where aflatoxin is likely to become a risk in US corn in the very near-term future, just the next decade, 2031 to 2040, and describe what the implications are for US and global food security of the aflatoxin risk, and to end on a positive note, what we could possibly do about it in terms of both climate smart and green innovations. So first, some background on aflatoxin. Aflatoxin was the very first mycotoxin that was discovered. Mycotoxin simply refers to any toxin that is produced by a fungus that colonizes our food crops. In the upper left, you can see the microscopic image of Aspergillus flavus, which is the fungus that produces aflatoxin in corn. Aflatoxin is produced primarily by the fungi Aspergillus flavus and Aspergillus parasiticus. It was discovered in 1960 in a rather gruesome manner. In that year, in the United Kingdom, over 100,000 turkeys died from consuming contaminated peanut meal. Now, for goodness knows how long, we've known that when we see that food is moldy, we really ought to throw it out. In some cases, moldy food is consumed and there is no harmful effect. Unfortunately, there are particular fungi that not only give a nasty moldy appearance, but they are actually also producing toxins. And so in this particular case of the 100,000 turkey deaths, it was found that this contaminated peanut meal that was consumed had high levels of Aspergillus parasiticus infection and aflatoxin contamination. Aflatoxin is primarily a contaminant of the crops corn, peanuts, tree nuts such as almonds, pistachios, walnuts, hazelnuts, macadamia nuts, and various different spices. And the important thing to understand about the Aspergilli fungi is that they are warm weather fungi. So roughly aflatoxin is a problem with these particular crops grown between roughly 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south latitude in a band around the equator. What that means is that the populations that are the most vulnerable worldwide are those that are living in warm climates for whom corn and peanuts are dietary staples. And this would be primarily populations in sub-Saharan Africa, in South, Southeast, and East Asia, and in Central America. Here in the United States, aflatoxin is perennially a problem in corn that's grown in the US South. I'll explain later why that thus far it has not really been a food safety related issue. What are the human health effects associated with aflatoxin exposure? Well, we've also known for about 60 years that aflatoxin causes liver cancer. In fact, it is the most potent naturally occurring human liver carcinogen. Some of our earlier studies found that there are over 100,000 cases of liver cancer leading to death every year that are caused by aflatoxin in the food supply, but it's not at all evenly distributed around the world. Again, it's mostly cases in sub-Saharan Africa, South, Southeast, and East Asia, and Central America. In particular, aflatoxin exposure synergizes with chronic infection with either hepatitis B or hepatitis C virus, such that if you are chronically infected with one of these viruses in the liver, so there is a state of chronic inflammation in your liver, and you are consuming aflatoxin at high enough doses that is detectable in your blood, then you have a 60-time higher liver cancer risk than an individual who is not chronically infected with hepatitis B or C, and also is consuming relatively lower levels of aflatoxin in the diet. Over the last 60 years, we've also found that aflatoxin it causes acute aflatoxicosis at very high doses that has a high case fatality rate of about 40%. Childhood stunting, and immune system dysfunction at somewhat lower doses. So it's definitely not something that you want to encounter in your food. You can see these pictures of corn and peanuts that you should avoid consuming. Now, why is it that it's not really a problem as far as food safety yet in the United States? It's because the Food and Drug Administration regulates aflatoxin in our food and has been doing so ever since 1969. So we have action levels for maximum allowable aflatoxin in human food, pet food, and a variety of different livestock and poultry feeds. Therefore, in the US, in terms of aflatoxin in corn, the aflatoxin-related losses are not so much on the human and animal health sides, but are primarily economic to corn growers, on the tone of about maybe 50 million to over $1 billion per year. Now, why is there such a large range in this case? We had done a study about 6 years ago that looked at 3 consecutive years in the United States, 2011, 2012, and 2013. The levels of aflatoxin that were found in corn being grown throughout the United States. And we found this enormous range in economic losses in those 3 years. If you're wondering why the losses were so high in 2012, so as to reach over $1 billion losses just due to aflatoxin in that year, it's because that was, for those of you who live in the Midwest, you may remember that 10 years ago, there were very hot and dry summers throughout the Midwest. Aspergillus flavus, which is normally confined to the southern states, then spread northward to the Midwest, primarily to the Corn Belt. And now suddenly, corn growers in Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Nebraska were experiencing aflatoxin problems that they had rarely encountered before. And that was what was causing the large economic losses. So of course, this begs the question, we know that in general, the globe is warming. So how is near-term climate change going to change aflatoxin risk in the United States? The way that our research team went about this analysis was to look at aflatoxin-related insurance claims. About 85% of the corn growers in the United States right now purchase crop insurance, and the USDA heavily subsidizes this at about 62% of the cost. Now, the corn grower can then make an insurance claim later during the season if there is some sort of problem, for example, related to insect pests or drought or hail, heavy winds, and aflatoxin is one of the categories for which they can make an insurance claim. So we were interested in analyzing this because from farmers' economics perspectives, the insurance claims do mimic real life. Aflatoxin levels are high enough that they will experience that their corn is going to be rejected at the grain elevator because it does not meet FDA action levels. We also know anecdotally that in the last 20 years, there were 3 years, 2005, 2006, 2012, where there were very hot and dry summers in the Midwest and aflatoxin spread to the Corn Belt. The costs were enormous. So we thought, okay, well, we need to really study this problem from the perspective of climate change. So what we did in our work was first to develop and validate a model of aflatoxin risk as a function of a variety of different climatic factors, such as maximum and minimum daily temperatures, rainfall and drought, and grower practices such as the planting of transgenic Bt corn, which protects against insect damage, as well as irrigation. For the years 2011 to 2020, for multiple different corn growing counties around the United States, we then used that model to project aflatoxin risk in the United States for the years 2031 to 2040. This is the econometric model that we developed to estimate aflatoxin-related insurance claim risk. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail here, although I'm happy to describe this, to talk about this with you later, but I wanted to share with you some of the considerations that we had as well as our data sources. Here are some of the things to consider. So why is it that we should be concerned about aflatoxin? Because Aspergillus flavus's preferred temperature range, both for growing as well as for producing aflatoxin, is roughly between 32 to 38 degrees centigrade, which is roughly 90 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, here's a bit of an interesting story from an agronomic standpoint. Aspergillus flavus can infect corn and start to produce aflatoxin through 2 primary methods that are both affected by climate change. Some of you in the audience may know that corn is what is called a selfer. Every corn plant is both male and female. So during a corn plant stage that's known as anthesis, the male part of the corn, which is the part that's the anthers that spread the pollen, and the female part of the corn, the silks, both come out together, and every pollen grain is meant to fertilize one silk. So you're familiar with silk if you've consumed corn on the cob. It's the silk that you pull apart. That's actually the silks that they haven't been fertilized by pollen grains. So unfortunately, what happens in the case, every silk is a long tube. Unfortunately, the spores of Aspergillus flavus can actually travel through the tube at the same time as the pollen grains. So it reaches all the way from the top of the tube down to the bottom of the tube to the corn cob, and then starts to produce aflatoxin. That is the primary way by which Aspergillus flavus can infect corn in the silking stage. And then in the dent stage, which is when the kernel develops and plumps out, then insects can damage the kernel, basically causing a break in the corn kernel. And then the fungus loves starch. It senses the starch, it colonizes the corn kernels, and then begins to produce aflatoxin. So in our model, we took into account that in the near-term future, corn planting dates and hence the silking and dent stages are going to change in the future. Now that's important if we want to know which days have particularly hot and dry conditions. In addition, irrigation and BT corn both reduce aflatoxin risk by reducing drought and insect pest damage, and that can lower the risk of Aspergillus flavus infection and subsequent aflatoxin production. And if you're interested in reading about it, it's in this paper that we published in Scientific Reports. Basically, what we found is the following. If you're a corn grower, you really don't want to see a hot and dry June and July and a wet September. Those are the conditions that mean extremely high aflatoxin risk. We used a number of different databases. For our historical data on climatic conditions, we used databases of NASA, NOAA, and Kynatec, which is a grower survey company, to find out whether they were irrigating their corn and or if they planted BT corn. In order to project future climate, we used 16 different models that were available on the NASA website, including a variety of, so NOAA has produced a climate model projecting until I think the year 2099, the daily maximum and minimum temperature for every single county in the United States. CSIRO in Australia has also produced such a model, MIRAC at University of Tokyo, and IPSL in France. The particular scenario that we imagined is called RCP 8.5. You've probably have seen these if you've looked at climate studies, RCP 8.5, 4.5. What does that mean? RCP stands for Representative Concentration Pathway. That is, each of these models says, well, if your greenhouse gas level in the atmosphere is at this level, then this is how much the temperature is going to warm. And if it's at this level because of better controls, then the surface of the Earth will not warm as much. We made this assumption that it was going to be RCP 8.5 in the near future. That's business as usual, because even as our climate policies are improving, there are many countries in the world, such as China and India and other developing and middle-income countries where there's a growing middle class. They're consuming more meat than ever. They are driving more cars. And so roughly it's going to be a bit of a wash. And we think that is going to be business as usual for the next, say, next 20 years. Now, I want to show you some of our results. First, we wanted to look at changes in corn planting dates compared to the historical average. And what we saw was that in many parts of the South, many of the farmers will be likely planting their corn earlier, whereas in much of the Midwest, they'll be planting later. And this is something that corn growers talk over with extension specialists to say, when should we plant our corn based on maximizing yield as well as feasibility? Because if the ground is flooded, you can't really plant corn at a particular time. Next, what we found is the following. Let me deconstruct this figure a bit for you. The left maps represent a particular stage in corn planting, which corresponds to about midsummer, which is after silking. That is the whole pollen meeting silk scenario. And the right graphs represent after dent, which is when each of the kernels have filled out with starch. So what we really don't want to see is that it's a really dry period during the midsummer. And unfortunately, per the upper left map, that is what we are projecting in the years 2031 to 2040, that although Texas is going to be a bit wetter during the midsummer, much of the Midwest is actually going to be drier. What you see in after dent, you have more kind of a combination of wetter and drier conditions. As for daily minimum and maximum temperatures, what we see is that some parts of Texas will actually become a little bit cooler, and then Kansas and Missouri in particular are going to become quite a bit hotter at the time that the corn is silking, and also some Midwestern states. Now, why is it important to also take into account minimum daily temperature? Because the corn plants actually rely on a little bit of coolness during the nighttime to recover. And if the night times also become much too hot, then the corn plant never has a chance to recover, and that means it's more susceptible to fungal infection. So this is what we found in terms of aflatoxin risk. Basically, what you see in the left maps are the situation in aflatoxin-related insurance claims in the years 2011 to 2020. What you see in the right graphs are aflatoxin risk as we project it for 2031 to 2040. Unfortunately, what this means is that the darker squares, the different corn planting counties, means that there's going to be higher aflatoxin risk, particularly hitting Kansas and Missouri a bit hotter, but you can see even in the major corn belt states like Nebraska, Iowa, and Illinois, aflatoxin problems are going to increase, and this is going to mean drastically increased costs to corn growers. What are the implications of these results? What we see is that in the very near-term future, so I mean, this is just starting from 9 years from now, aflatoxin risk is going to intensify in the Midwest in the very near future. And in the near term, the aflatoxin problems will be most intense in Kansas and Missouri. You can see in the bottom left graph, the percentages of corn that's being produced in various different states around the US. And then there are smaller but significant increases in aflatoxin risk in the major corn belt states, such as Iowa, Illinois, and Nebraska. The risk, incidentally, is going to decrease in Texas, partly because it's going to become too hot for the fungus to survive. But that's not good news either, because that could mean that the corn plant may not survive either. So this could have major food safety and security implications for both the United States, per the lower left map, as well as for the rest of the world, per the lower right pie chart. The US makes up about 40% of total world corn exports. And so if suddenly in the next decade we're going to be having a lot more aflatoxin in the corn, that could have fairly serious implications for human and animal health around the world. That's all the bad news. What's some of the good news? There are some agricultural interventions that can help to reduce aflatoxin. Personally, I'm thinking that we really do need to turn to biotech solutions as climate smart and green innovations in the near future. How can we genetically enhance crops' resistance to drought, to heat, or insect pest damage? We've tried for a number of years using conventional breeding methods. We've had quite a great deal of success with transgenic BT corn, but now 82% of the field corn that we're planting in the US is already BT corn. So now we need to think about further solutions. Might we turn to CRISPR-Cas9, for example, gene editing technologies that can help to improve the quality of our corn or its resilience in climate conditions in the near future? Good agricultural practices such as irrigation, planting the right hybrid in the right geographic location, they've always been helpful, but consider the problem with irrigation that we actually now have a sinking water table throughout much of the Midwest and the plains areas of the United States. So we can't rely on irrigation and increasing irrigation in the near-term future, which is why we really do need to be thinking about innovative technologies in agriculture. I would say that in the United States, we're already handling post-harvest situations pretty well. And in general, we might think about shifting where we're actually growing corn in the United States. What's going to be the new corn belt? Is it going to shift ever further north? As it is, we're already growing more corn now in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the Dakotas. And maybe that's what's going to happen, that all of our crops are, like where we're planting them, is going to shift northward in the United States for better food safety. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail. I just like to include this particular slide because if you happen to be in a part of the world where you're concerned that there is aflatoxin in your food, then there are a variety of different dietary interventions, such as the inclusion of leafy green vegetables, which we had at lunch today and yesterday, because the chlorophyll actually does absorb aflatoxin in the gut and it becomes excreted rather than reaching our bloodstream and then reaching the liver. Curcumin actually competitively inhibits the enzymes, the cytochrome P450 enzymes that convert aflatoxin into its carcinogenic form, the aflatoxin 8,9 epoxide. So adding curry to the diet is also beneficial. Consuming cruciferous vegetables, allium vegetables such as garlic and leeks and onions can all help to induce phase 2 enzymes in our liver, green tea polyphenols to reduce inflammation, increasing dietary diversity, moving away from corn and nuts, consuming foods that have lower aflatoxin levels, and being vaccinated against hepatitis B. To summarize, aflatoxin causes diverse harmful health effects worldwide to humans and to animals, and enormous economic loss already to US corn growers in the United States. Our climate model projects that aflatoxin risks are going to spread to the Corn Belt and to other parts of the Midwest in the very near term future. So this is something that we need to be turning attention to now, because there are large impacts to US and global food security. Some solutions may be in terms of better breeding methods for aflatoxin-resistant corn hybrids. And in the future, I would be curious to talk with any of you who might be interested in applying this type of modeling to other food and waterborne pathogens that are also affected by climatic factors. And finally, I would like to acknowledge that this is funded by one of my USDA grants that our national program leader, Dr. Mark Carter, is here. My co-project directors are David Hennessy and Gary Monkfold at Iowa State University. And you can see the picture of my research team. This was what, a pre-COVID picture. And thank you very much.
All right, we're going to move on to our final presentation of the afternoon, which is going to be from Allison Thompson. Allison joined the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, or FFAR, as the Ag Mission Scientific Program Director just recently, just in January of this year. She initially uncovered an interest in agriculture and climate change as an undergraduate soil science student, so good to see that she's maintaining it here. And she's garnered more than 20 years of experience in climate research. She served as an advisor, author, and steering group member for a variety of scientific organizations, including the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the United States Global Change Research Program, and the Global Land Program, and has contributed to over 70 peer-reviewed publications. I will welcome Allison to the stage.
Thank you. This is great, and those are really fantastic presentations. And I think you all now have just had a crash course in agricultural policy and a crash course in some crop sciences. So I'm going to round things out for the afternoon by bringing us to the farmers. And I think, there we go. One of the great things about moving to a foundation is I no longer have grants, I'm giving grants. I also gave up most of my advisory roles when I got there, so no real conflicts to report. And I want to talk today about a few things. So talking about the role of agriculture in greenhouse gas emissions, just kind of level set what we're talking about with climate change and agriculture specifically, what risks agriculture is facing due to climate. So we just heard about one very specific one. I'm going to back out a little bit and look more broadly, but that's a fantastic example of all sorts of things that can be happening to agriculture as climate changes. I want to talk about regenerative agriculture. So taking it to the farmers, what are the farmers doing? As Martin ended his talk with, you can go out and talk to these agricultural ministers and the policies, and that has an enormous amount of impact. But ultimately, it's the hundreds of millions of individual agricultural producers and who matter. What they're doing is what matters. And so that's really what it comes down to, is their practices, whether we call them regenerative or other things. And then kind of a unique position that agriculture is in. I'm sure many of you have seen graphics like this. This is just the Global Carbon Program's, Global Carbon Project's most recent carbon balance. You can see the biosphere there is that green arrow down. So land is taking up carbon. Lots of that's happening in forests, but much of that is also happening in soils. So soils can take up carbon from the atmosphere. We also have that sort of orange arrow going the other way. This is with we talked a little bit earlier about how expansion of cropland could be very negative, and this is why, because you're taking land out of permanent vegetation, whatever that is, it's forest or other, and releasing that carbon and starting to till the soil, and you're starting to release a lot of carbon. So there's a lot of risk to that. But this just puts a little bit in perspective of the size of the whole biosphere. when it comes to the climate challenge. When we take it to sectors, so this is a US sector specific approach, you're looking at how much are different sectors emitting. There's, the big three here for us are transportation, electricity, and industry. And so really when we talk about mitigating climate change, at some point you have to decarbonize all of those sectors. We got to get the carbon out of them somehow. But agriculture is still 11% of the emissions in this country. And agriculture here is the production of agriculture, producing crops and animal products. It doesn't include things like food waste or other things in the broader food system. Often people will sort of try and calculate that out and can get a much bigger number when you start talking about things like that. But when you talk about just producing the crops and the animals, it's that 11% piece. So significant, but also there's a lot of other things out there. One other interesting thing about agriculture, if you look at those bubbles at the top, it is actually a more significant source of the methane and the nitrous oxide, which are more potent greenhouse gases. And so we have a lot of focus on mitigating those specific emissions from things like fertilizer. Of course, you've heard about the cow burps and all of that, the methane that comes from that. So the number we use when we're talking about this then is that emissions are 11 to 13% of the total, whether you're looking nationally or globally. It might make a slight difference, but we're in that range. It's challenging to quantify some of this. So I'll talk a little bit about carbon markets, which is something you might have heard about, but it gets really challenging to actually quantify this really with a high degree of certainty. And so this is where there's some challenges in agriculture that are different from other sectors when you talk about mitigation. And really the perturbations is where you have to look for what are the big risks. So changes in land use and land cover change, right? So actually changing from agriculture to something else or some other land cover to agriculture, and then land management changes where you're actually changing what you do on the ground, which is more where my focus is okay, what are farmers doing? What else could they be doing? And what impact would that have on climate adaptation and mitigation? And I think the other thing is just emissions reductions are needed across all sectors. We talk about agriculture, but really the problem is society-wide, as you know. This is a graphic from one of the most recent IPCC reports. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change puts these out every 7 years or so. This is the most recent one on impacts. They're starting to frame a lot of this also as risks, so not just climate impact, but the risks that different sectors are facing and how you mitigate that risk, how you look at the components of risk, which they have broken out risk into 3 components of the climate hazard. So what is the climate hazard that's happening? What is your vulnerability to that hazard? And what's your exposure to that hazard, right? So if you think about extreme heat or something like that as a person in your human health, you can reduce your exposure to that extreme heat by going into an air-conditioned building. Or if you farm workers, we can reduce their exposure to extreme heat by a number of ways, changing their working hours and things like that. So in many ways, there's ways to reduce your exposure. Agriculture has less leeway to reduce exposure to the climate, right? 99.9% of our agricultural production happens outside. Some of it you can mitigate with things like irrigation, but that's limited, right? So really you have to look more at the vulnerability. So adapting in a way that reduces your vulnerability. The only real way for agriculture to reduce exposure is through mitigation. So making the problem less severe over time. And to get to a couple of the more specific climate impacts and things that agriculture is facing, a huge one, of course, is disruptions to the water cycle. So not just, an average change in precipitation, which is kind of hard to see, like you were saying earlier, what time of year that flood happens matters an enormous amount for agriculture. It's like what crop are you growing, what time of year are you experiencing these extreme events? That it all gets very specific very quickly. There are a few sort of broad level trends and things that we know, though. For example, the snowpack here in the US, these are projections, I think actually using that same RCP 8.5, showing that by the end of the century, really significantly less snowpack. And that's hugely important to agriculture in the US West, right? That snowpack as a natural reservoir, it holds the water during time of year when nothing is growing and releases that slowly during the growing season. And we're already seeing in agriculture real implications in California, right? Reduced snowpack in the Sierra Nevada. And that's not just because there's less precipitation, it also has to do with the temperatures increasing. Some of that, more of that snow is just evaporating without melting. So there's real implications for agriculture from this reduction in snowpack that's forecast to be happening. Another figure here is on our heavy precipitation over land. So it's still really hard for these climate models to say what dates those precipitation events are going to happen on. That's still a really challenging climate science problem in the models. But But we do know some things. For example, that as the global mean temperature increases, these high precipitation events will become both more likely to occur, so they'll happen more often, and they'll become more intense. So each one will have more water in it. You'll have higher precipitation. So they get worse and there'll be more of them. So there's, even if we can't pinpoint when they're going to happen, we can say they are going to be a greater risk for agriculture down the line just because of that intensity. Another thing, and this is one, those are ones that farmers can't do a lot about, right? So, oh gosh, what are we going to do here? But one we can have a little more control over and how we manage agricultural lands is soil moisture. And so this is the combination, right? As temperatures are higher, it's drying out vegetation, drying out the soils. There's less moisture. This is a problem you might hear about for wildfires, right? As the temperatures are higher, wildfires are more likely to ignite and more extreme. But the same thing with soils. It's drier. And you combine that with these changes in the hydrologic cycle, you have much more reduced soil moisture, which really impacts crop production. There are ways to manage lands, though, that increase the soil water holding capacity and the potential to hold on to what moisture does fall. And I included this, so this is also from the IPCC about, simultaneous extreme events compounding risk, right? So, and this ties it into the full food system and takes it to the more down into the realm of impact on livelihoods as well. We have these increasing extreme events. There's also that human component of the increasing stress on farm workers who are out there working. We hear a lot about this in the news, I think, recently as well. Reduced productivity, but also harmful to their health. Over time, you're seeing reduced yields, which reduces household incomes, increases food price, and you get potentially these global effects. A good example is actually happening right now, not fully climate driven, but we do have, we have drought in the US West, which is a high wheat producing region, right? We also are having climate related disasters in India, flooding and other extreme weather going on that's impacting their wheat production. At the same time, of course, there's ongoing conflict in Ukraine is having a huge impact on wheat. So there's just a huge, right now, multiple stressors, some climate related, others not, on different wheat bread baskets around the world. And so having that all happen simultaneously becomes a real food security concern. So taking it now, we don't have a lot of time left, but I want to talk a little bit about then agricultural practices. So this is all, what can farmers do? What are they doing? What can they do? How are we talking about it? I think we've already heard a few of these words. What is sustainable agriculture? What's regenerative agriculture? What's climate smart agriculture? If you're an engineer or know an engineer, they're probably talking to you about circularity, right? They're big into circular food and agriculture systems right now and thinking through that. The good news is when you take all of these and look at, okay, well, what does it mean for what we do on the ground? It means doing pretty much the same thing. So if you're talking to a farmer, you don't have to worry about which jargon word you pick, right? Or even pick any of them. You want to be talking to them about enhancing their soil health, which increases that water holding capacity, makes their soils more resilient to higher temperatures, as well as, makes all the biology going on within the soil more resistant to those higher temperatures and gives you better moisture retention. You want to be increasing the carbon you're putting into the system and diversifying your system. What does that look like? It can be a lot of different things. Increasing the number of crops in your rotation, adding in things like cover crops, adding in agroforestry practices, but there's a lot of things that fall into that bucket of increasing diversity in carbon inputs, and then be more efficient. And that's largely about reducing your emissions. The emissions from just, driving a tractor, running an irrigation pump aren't huge, but the more efficient we can be and the more reductions you can achieve in those also helps you across all of these goals. So I put all these words up here, but they don't really matter. I talk a lot about climate smart agriculture and what I'll just define that in a minute. The reducing vulnerability component I talked about earlier, so that's really where adaptation comes in. This is how farmers can reduce their individual vulnerability to climate change, is by adapting their operations to manage, to increase that soil water holding capacity and reduce the heat stress on the underground, they call it sometimes the livestock, right? The underground biota in the soils that are feeding their crops, as well as the crops themselves. And one thing I think to keep in mind with adaptation is the concept that maladaptation is starting to emerge as well, which is the idea that you can adapt in ways that are a net negative, right? They can actually make your problems worse or make the problem of climate change worse. So you don't want to be taking adaptation actions that increase greenhouse gas emissions, result in land conversion, right? Increasing, chopping down the forest for more soybeans and things like that. You want to stay away from those types of adaptations. So being thoughtful about your adaptations is also important. So with climate change, the climate smart agriculture, I frame it as meeting both goals simultaneously. So avoiding those maladaptation options, but looking at practices that either or both mitigate climate change by reducing emissions or by increasing carbon in the soil or by increasing the carbon stock in incorporating trees or agroforestry into a cropping landscape. And then those things that help with adaptation as well. So, as I mentioned, efficiency, reducing inputs. So one huge, as I mentioned, nitrous oxide earlier is a big climate forcing agent, and synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, which we haven't talked about here too much, requires an enormous amount of energy to produce, and then also releases a lot of nitrous oxide emissions at the field level. So one of the most important things we talk about climate smart agriculture with farmers, being more efficient with that nitrogen, using organic sources where you can. So bringing in manure or other compost or other organic sources of fertilizer, which also has the side benefit of increasing your carbon content of soils, right? Including organic matter with that nitrogen fertilizer. There's also methane in that primarily is a result of rice production, either animals, ruminant animals and rice production. And there are ways to manage for that as well. Adaptation, fortunately, is many of the same practices that enhance soil health. A lot of them involve keeping the ground covered year round. Continuous living cover is one of the things that's talked about, keeping some growing root in the ground all year round, even if you're growing an annual crop like corn, and then that diversity. So these adaptation options also improve food security. So this is another communication point from the IPCC, which is really that these things I'm talking about, so agroforestry, diversification of the landscape and the farm, can help to also do things like strengthen biodiversity, which improves livelihoods, health and well-being, and food security and nutrition. So there's a lot of potential win-win-wins here, which is kind of the unique position of agriculture. One warning that the IPCC has given, though, is that in their most recent synthesis that came out on climate impacts earlier this year, so this is synthesizing, the last decade of research on climate impacts and agriculture, is that some natural solutions may not work as you get past a certain point. So we talk about soil carbon and increasing the carbon content of the soil. As temperatures rise, you get increased activity, microbial activity in the soil, which might increase respiration. So you might, in fact, not be able to increase your soil carbon as much as temperature rises. So there is this impact as we go hotter. Will Texas become inhospitable to just growing corn, right? Because the temperature rises too much. And so what impacts do some of those things have? Lack of fresh water, which we've talked about, could potentially be impact for agriculture, particularly lack of snowpack. And their warning is that, really we do want to stay below this 2 degrees C, because beyond that, they see the science showing that it might be challenging to farm multiple staple crops that we rely on in many current growing areas. So they are really sounding the alarm with the most recent report that these impacts can get very serious, and we need to be adapting, but we also do at the same time need to be focusing on that mitigation to avoid that outcome. Mitigation in agriculture, just some ideas or ways that people are talking about this. The top line there, carbon sequestration, then reducing those methane and nitrous oxide emissions, reducing conversion of other ecosystems to agriculture, restoring ecosystems, and then improving sustainable forest management. You see the other ones at the bottom there that you all, I think, care about as well, but those aren't part of what I'm discussing, but you can see the relative size of also dietary changes. And I think the important thing here is also to notice those error bars. Those are pretty significant, right? The soil carbon, a little bit over 3, but anywhere between, 1.5 and close to 6. So there's a huge potential range and huge uncertainty in some of these mitigations because of the complexity of carbon cycling in ecosystems. Zeroing in on the carbon sequestration a little bit, again, the diversity of projections here as to what's even possible. This is from the Project Drawdown's recent report, where they have a couple of examples here in the middle of scenarios they've run out. And really the message here is just that there's a wide variety of predictions as to what global soils can actually sequester under cropland management. And is a lot of this scientific uncertainty. Soils are very challenging to study. You have to go out and dig them up, and digging them up changes them. And there's a lot of work being done now in the private sector. There's a lot of interest in potentially using this as an offset, soil carbon as an offset, or in carbon market schemes for sustainability or private sector climate goals. So that's actually driving investment in new measurements and doing more remote sensing, probe kind of, or other remote sensing technologies to measure carbon in soils in a way that's non-destructive, and makes it cheaper and easier, which would potentially change the picture. That technology change could alter how we think about the potential of soil carbon sequestration. So really closing out, agriculture is in something of a unique position here. If you think about some other sectors and how they're trying to adapt and all of that, there can be trade-offs, right? If you look at, we're all in a city that can get very hot in the summer. Our adaptation to it getting hotter is to go inside and turn the air conditioning on, which releases emissions from the energy used to drive that. So agriculture is in kind of a unique situation where both adaptation and mitigation can be the same practices. And so, being able to then take these ideas to the farmers and say, these are the practices that can really help you over time maintain your ability to produce what it is you're producing. And at the same time, they'll be having that beneficial impact for all of us through mitigation. There is a challenge in identifying the right practices, right? So all the things I've talked about, it's not universal. Not everyone can do cover crops, right? Agroforestry does not make sense in certain situations. So you really have to work on individual solutions for those hundreds of millions of farms out there in the world. So there is a big challenge here. And just to close out, that's the challenge, of course, that my program is working to identify more and develop solutions for. So we have a partnership program we're building out at FAR called Ag Mission, which is collaboration on research needed to understand climate smart practices, as well as get them adopted. So really our focus is co-development, work with the farmers, identify the solutions that are going to work for them and help get those adopted broadly. So with that, I will take any questions in the next minute, I guess. Thank you.